All right, today we are going to get into one of the most sobering, most challenging passages in the entire Gospel of Matthew. We're talking about a scene of final judgment, a moment where everything snaps into focus and eternal destinies are sealed. So let's take a deep look at what's known as the Shepherd's Great Divide.
You know, the entire scene is built around this incredibly powerful, but also very ordinary image. For anyone listening to Jesus at the time, a shepherd sorting his flock was just a normal, everyday sight. But here, Jesus turns it into this profound metaphor for the final, unchangeable judgment of all people.
So to really wrap our heads around this, we're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll see how this judgment isn't a surprise quiz, but the end of a series of tests. Then, we'll ask, who is actually being judged here? We'll also dig into the original Greek, and trust me, it's fascinating to see the heart of the matter. We'll look at the brilliant nature analogies Jesus uses, and finally, face the 2 eternal outcomes he lays out.
Okay, first things first. It is so important to understand that this story about the sheep and the goats doesn't just come out of nowhere. It's actually the huge finale to 3 parables in a row, and each one acts as a test for anyone who claims to follow the king. Let's see how they connect.
So right before this, we get the parable of the 10 virgins. That was a test of our hidden personal relationship with God. Were we truly ready? Then came the parable of the 3 slaves, which was a test of our roles. What do we do with what we've been given? But this last scene, the sheep and the goats, it's something else entirely. This is the final exam. It's not about relationship or role anymore, but about our fundamental, unchangeable, true nature. It pulls back the curtain on who we really are.
All right, so let's get to a really crucial question. Who is actually being judged here? The common assumption is that it's about separating believers from non-believers, the church from the world. But the text itself points to something much, much more unsettling.
This verse from the Apostle Peter, well, it's like a key that unlocks this whole passage in Matthew. Judgment, it says, begins with the household of God. So this sorting of the sheep and goats, it's not primarily about outsiders versus insiders. It's a sorting that starts inside the shepherd's own flock, among the very people who claim to be his followers.
And the metaphor Jesus uses is just brilliant for this. Back then, it was totally standard practice to herd sheep and goats together. They spent all day on the same hillsides, ate the same food, drank from the same water, and were led by the very same shepherd. The goats weren't some enemy force that infiltrated the flock. They were a normal, everyday part of it, right up until the shepherd decided it was time to separate them.
And here's the proof right in the text. When they're condemned, the goats don't argue with the king's authority. In fact, they called him Kurios, which means Lord. Think about that. Their shock, their confusion, their use of that specific word, it tells us everything. They genuinely 100% thought they belonged. They assumed they were good to go, that they were entitled to his blessing.
So that leads us to the million-dollar question, right? If both groups were in the same flock, under the care of the same shepherd, what was the difference? What went so disastrously wrong for the goats? The answer, it turns out, has nothing to do with their location and everything to do with their nature.
To really find that answer, we have to do what we love to do and dig into the original Greek. Because when we do, it reveals 2 totally different ways of thinking, 2 completely different spiritual operating systems. One is based on instinct, and the other on cold, hard calculation.
The sheep are called the dikaios, the righteous. Now, this isn't just a pat on the back for doing good deeds. It's a description of their very being. Their acts of kindness, feeding the hungry, visiting the prisoner. It was all an instinctive reflex. It was as natural to them as breathing. They weren't keeping score or trying to earn points. They were just being themselves. So much so that they are genuinely surprised when they get rewarded for it.
Now let's flip that coin over and look at the goats. In their defense, they use the verb diakoneo, which means to minister or to serve. They ask, "Lord, when did we see you?" and not "minister to you." Their question tells us everything about their mindset. To them, service was a formal duty. It was a calculated transaction. It was something you performed for someone important, someone who could give you status or recognition in return. So look at this side by side. The difference is just stark. The sheep, the dikaios, acted from an inner nature. The goats, the diakoneo, operated out of a sense of duty. The sheep were almost unconscious of their service. It just flowed out of them. The goats, on the other hand, kept a mental spreadsheet of their service and were only aware of what they didn't do for the king directly. And that's why the sheep were surprised by the reward and the goats were absolutely floored by the condemnation.
And who were these people they were supposed to be serving? The king calls them Elekistos Erophos, the least of these my brethren. Now this is critical. This isn't referring to some professional clergy or famous Christian leaders. It means any and every individual disciple of Jesus, especially the ones who are hurting, poor, forgotten, and marginalized. The real test was whether they saw the king in the face of a brother or sister who could offer them absolutely nothing in return. And that was a truth the goats were totally blind to.
Now, this is where the genius of Jesus' teaching really shines. He uses the common, well-known behaviors of sheep and goats as perfect, living metaphors for these two spiritual conditions. His audience would have gotten this in a heartbeat.
I mean, just look at the high-level contrast. Sheep are known for being dependent, they're community-oriented, they're willing to follow. Goats, they're famous for being independent, stubborn, willful. They're literally called escape artists. It's a perfect mirror for the two spiritual mindsets we've been talking about.
Let's dive a little deeper on sheep. They are what's called gregarious, which is a fancy way of saying they instinctively flock together. They stick close for safety and support. They know, deep in their bones, that they need a shepherd to guide and protect them. They're basically a walking picture of humility, community, and dependence.
And then you have the goats. They are legendary for their stubborn independence. They are agile escape artists that are always testing the fences. They're not easily contained. And here's a fascinating detail. They're aggressive browsers, not gentle grazers. They eat everything. Twigs, leaves, bark, and can be so destructive they can literally eat themselves out of a habitat, destroying the very environment that's supposed to sustain them. What a powerful image for a self-serving spirituality that consumes for its own sake, but never builds up the community.
So, the parable then moves to its incredibly solemn conclusion. The consequences of these two different natures are finally laid bare. The separation happens, and the king speaks two final, irreversible sentences.
And the contrast here is just breathtakingly stark. To the sheep on his right, the king says, "Come, you who are blessed, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world." Their home was always planned for them. But to the goats on his left, he says, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels." And did you catch that? Notice the fire was not prepared for them. It was prepared for the devil. They just end up in a place they were never ever meant to be.
So the final warning here is just crystal clear. This passage isn't about earning your salvation by doing a bunch of good deeds. It's that the deeds are the proof. They are the fruit that reveals the nature of the tree. A true, living faith will inevitably produce the fruit of instinctive, uncalculated mercy and love for the family of God. And a faith without that fruit, well, is shown to be no faith at all.
And so, this ancient story leaves us with this profound, deeply personal question that echoes right down to our own lives today. When we look at how we treat others, especially our brothers and sisters who are in need, what does it reveal about us? Does it reveal the humble, dependent, community-focused nature of a sheep, or the stubborn, independent, self-serving nature of a goat?